Versailles is the symbol of the most brilliant palace in Europe. Beautiful ladies, brilliant gentlemen, intrigues, affairs, gossip, and of course he, the Sun King. This is how we imagine Versailles thanks to the books and films about the angelic's adventures. But what was the daily life of Versailles really like? Why do we feel sorry for the king's favorite, Louise de la Vallière? How did the lady feel after the king had noticed her? Why did the king stink? And why did the Versailles courtiers prefer to sleep in a wooden barrel on a brazier in the winter? Did the courtiers bathe, and why was the air of Versailles considered extremely harmful? Is it true that the aristocrats paid for the right to be present at the king's defecation? And why was the courtier's life at risk? Today we will tell you about the hidden part, everyday life in the famous king's home. So, meet Louise de la Vallière, the lady with whom the Count of Bragelonne was in love in the Dumas novel. She is only 17 years old, and we will see the legendary court of the Sun King through her eyes. Before the reign of Louis XIV, the residence of the French monarchs was the Louvre. But the king, named the God-given, decided to build a new palace in the suburbs of Paris and made it the most brilliant palace in Europe, spending a tremendous amount of money. Now, the king is 23 and he's in love with 17-year-old Louise de la Vallière. But let's try to figure out if she was lucky or not. Imagine Louis XIV in love. The brilliant king, the courtiers hang on his every word and immediately spread it all over Europe. He is kneeling before our protagonist, squeezing her hands, begging for a kiss. And now let's try to imagine what the lady felt at this moment. The king was not handsome. His face was disfigured by smallpox. In addition, poor Louis XIV had terrible teeth for almost all his life and had bad breath. By the age of 40, he had only shapeless roots left. After a failed tooth extraction, water got into his nose and leaked out from the nose like a fountain when he drank. Since he had no teeth, he swallowed the food without chewing. At the same time, the Sun King was full of love. Considering servility at court, the position of the lady who won the king's attention was very difficult. Resist? No one had courage or desire to do this. Give in? But that meant to get compromised. In addition, all the details of your intimate meeting would be immediately disclosed throughout Europe. Every word of the Sun King, every smile, every look, every statement was discussed and commented by the court. To declare his love to our protagonist, Louise de la Vallière, the king had to arrange ballets, dress up as a shepherd, she played a shepherdess, and then in front of 5,000 courtiers he could confess his love to her, following the text of a commissioned play. Our protagonist stands out from all the countless favorites because she really seemed to love the king, unfortunately. She wasn't pretty either, and she limped after she had fallen off her horse. Her face was pockmarked. Here is how a contemporary described her. She is intelligent, lively, has the ability to judge things sensibly, is well-mannered, is great at history. She is gifted with a tender, compassionate heart. History stands in silence too often, but never visit the kitchen, as a historian wrote. What was the daily life of the most brilliant court in Europe? Despite its splendor, the castle was completely deprived of the comforts. It was very beautiful and terribly cold. In Versailles, some of the fireplaces didn't function. Not all the windows were closed, and the doors slammed over and over because of drafts. Among magnificent marble mirrors, there were such icy draughts that even the unpretentious Louis XIV, who didn't mind sleeping in a bed full of bedbugs, even he couldn't stand the cold of Versailles. The saucers on the royal table turned to ice jelly, the wine carafes ranked with ice, and the fire in fireplaces went out due to the snow stuffed into the white chimneys. Marquise de Rambouillet wore a bear skin on her body, and the Marshal of Luxembourg spent in a sedan chair all winter surrounded by hot water bottles. And another court lady found a completely unexpected way out of the situation. She wintered in a barrel placed on a brazier, risking being grilled. Add to this the fact that the fireplaces of Versailles had such a bad chimney draft that the courtiers and the king constantly lived in smoke. It was so thick that in the crowded galleries you could distinguish only vague moving shadows. But it wasn't the only problem. According to eyewitnesses, the air of Versailles was also harmful because of sweat and breath of many people. It was extremely stale. The palace had a kind of public lavatories, but often their condition was so terrible that some of the inhabitants of Versailles relieved themselves in a quiet corner. In addition, numerous dogs lived in Versailles, and they also didn't bother to find a proper place for a toilet. In the courtiers' rooms there were chamber pots, which were supervised by footmen, who mostly just poured them out the window. By the way, there were not enough sanitary pots for everyone, and many courtiers relieved themselves behind the curtains not to wait for a footman. In addition, Versailles was a huge hostel. As they say, 6,000 servants slept in one room. They didn't have footmen with chamber pots. Imagine how smelled the room. If the king and his favorites had their own bathrooms, but Louis's courtiers who lived in Versailles did not. They just wiped their bodies with a cloth, usually dry but sometimes soaked with something acidic. Well, even perfume couldn't mask the stench. But our protagonist, Louise de Lavalière, fell in love with Louis and was ready to put up with all this. But life or show was the hardest for her. The king's life consisted of a long list of ceremonies. Most of them took place in public. Courtiers appeared in his bedroom in the morning. Their number could reach up to 100 people. They were arranged in a certain order, depending on the rank, and a footman began the shaving procedure, which was observed by the guests. Moreover, the nobles had the honor of seeing the king dressing up. After that, he left his bedroom. By the way, the courtiers were awarded with such a favor for a reason. You had to pay a big sum for the opportunity to see the monarch's morning procedures. The courtiers also paid a lot of money to be present when the king goes to the toilet on a special chair with a slot. It was considered no less an honor than to attend a royal meal. It is interesting that any decently dressed person could get to Versailles to see how the king lives. And if you didn't have a hat or a sword, you could rent them at the entrance to the residence. And now imagine what it was like for our protagonist, Louise de Lavalière. She suffered the humiliation of being watched 24 hours a day, was hated by the queen and envied by her rivals. Louise was ashamed of her love and didn't dare to leave her head. She gave birth to 4 king's children, and immediately after birth, still dazed, half dead from weakness, she was forced to go to the court party to stop the malicious gossip with her presence. And even in the church she had no peace. She had to listen preachers blaming her for her scandalous behavior and pointing fingers at her. And she had to listen all this with a poker face, with a proud posture. Louise went to a convent several times, but when the king asked her to come back, she felt unable to refuse her lover and returned to this hell after all. She didn't know what was coming. To imagine cruel morals reigned there, that is enough to recall the famous Versailles heartthrob, de Lausanne. It was a man of a small stature, but that fact didn't prevent him from driving the most unapproachable ladies crazy. Among his victims were even 4 goddesses, 4 lovers of the king, including Louise de la Vallière. The secret of his popularity was simple. He was usually exquisitely courteous and extremely polite, but he treated his admirers like street girls. He even crushed one's hand with his heel publicly. But for some reason, this rudeness, this insolent brutality and arrogance attracted the ladies of Versailles so much. The Sun King made luxury mainstream by opening state-owned manufacture of wearing apparel. He raised fashion to a kind of law and created his own royal etiquette, which became an example for many European countries. Fashion trends of the French court spread across the continent immediately. Thus, the French fashion system became an influential element of French politics and culture for several centuries. And Louis XIV himself received all the rights of a trendsetter. Being at the court was incredibly expensive. Only in the man's wardrobe there were at least 30 suits for each day of the month. They were supposed to be changed daily. So, what about ladies? In the middle of his reign, Louis XIV issued a special decree on the mandatory cloth change according to the seasons. In spring and autumn, his courtiers were forced to wear light cloth. Velvet and satin were to wear in winter. Silk, lace, or gauze had to be worn in summer. The inhabitants of Versailles tried to outshine each other by luxurious outfits, because it could have an impact on Louis. The fashion race was so intense that the nobles were literally ruined because of the exorbitant spending on outfits. But the worst thing happened when Louis got a fistula because of excessive gluttony. Fistulas quickly became fashionable, and after the king's fistula was removed, many perfectly healthy courtiers volunteered for the same operation in the hope of attracting the king's attention. Let's imagine it's all over. You've become accustomed to Versailles, won the king's attention, and even enjoyed watching him defecate. Here we mention another reason why you wouldn't agree to shine at Versailles. If you are beautiful and popular, as well as ugly, and your husband is bored with you, you have too many chances to die quickly and painfully. You should always be careful of the poison, so you cannot smell the flower or touch the delivered letter. As we all remember from the Angelic movie, even your own dress can be deadly. One day, our protagonist, Louise de la Vallière, fell ill suddenly and seriously, so that she was afraid that she had been poisoned. On another occasion, the murderers had crept up on her balcony at night. She heard them trying to open the shutters and ran away in her sleepwear to the maid's room. The affair of the poisons at court was one of the darkest pages of King Sun's reign. It seems that poison was the easiest and most popular way to solve all your problems at court. The spouses poisoned their husbands or wives, and the favorites eliminated each other. Princess Henrietta Stuart, a relative of the king, was poisoned by her husband's favorite, who smeared poison on her glass. The technique of poisoning was so sophisticated that aristocrats personally bought food and prepared their own food, fearing treachery. Witnesses in the poisoner's case testified that the king's new favorite, Athénée de Montespan, poisoned a girl by sending her poison-soaked silk and gloves. The poison slowly got through the skin. The girl slowly lost her health, and her death looked almost natural. At the center of all these poisonings was a witch called La Voisin. Just imagine how terrified were investigators when it turned out that the ladies of the court were also involved in real devil worship, which was considered a much more serious crime in those days. By the way, this episode was included in the movie Angelic and the King. When the full scale of the poisoning at the court was revealed, the king himself shuddered. More than 400 people went to prison, 36 were executed, the rest of them went to prison or to exile or to the galleys. Let's go back to our protagonist. The position of Louise deteriorated greatly after the appearance of a new favorite, Athénée de Montespan. But she loved Louis deeply and endured everything. Louise accepted his infidelity and even agreed to become a servant to her triumphant rival and dress her up for the dates. Now she had to play the role of a screen. The king, upon his return from hunting, went into Louise's to powder himself and change his dress, and went to his new mistress. All this was so humiliating, but she kept enduring. Montespan was the opposite of Louise, accepting the congratulations of the countess, lying in bed, shiny and overdressed. What a pride! What a newfound power! The Marquise remained a favorite of Louis XIV for about 10 years, and was dismissed after the affair of the poisons, because of poisoning her enemies, including those whom de Montespan considered potential rivals. Well, what happened to our protagonist? Finally, one day, her life among those heartless people became unbearable, and Louise finally decided to go to a monastery to forget forever about the cruel court of Versailles. But she wasn't allowed to leave the palace just like that. The court wanted to get enough of her torment. She had a title of Duchess, so she was obliged to behave in accordance with her rank. She had to put on her formal dress and throw herself at the feet of the queen who hated her, begging for forgiveness. Before her departure, she was forced to dine with her naughty rival, who only pretended to be compassionate. Do like and subscribe if you enjoyed this story. Oh, and click on the bell so you get notified when the new episode comes out.